Um, I'm Carol Goldsmith, for those of you who may not know me. I suspect everybody does. For a long time, I've been very interested in cooking and culinary arts and so on. And I chose to read a piece by Ruth Reichel, who is a very distinguished American chef, food writer, and editor. Long career. Those of you who have heard me read before know that I like to read a little bio at the beginning before I read the actual passage. Ruth has been a restaurant critic for several publications for 20 years, including New West, California magazines, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times, culminating in 10 years as editor-in-chief of Condé Nast's publication, Gourmet magazine. She was culinary editor for the Modern Library and host of her own show on PBS, Gourmet's Adventures with Ruth. She's the author of several nonfiction books, memoirs, and novels. In 2009, she published Gourmet Today, a 1,000-page cookbook with over 1,000 recipes. Distinguished food journalist, she's the recipient of 6 James Baird Awards. Ruth Reichel was born in 1948 to a family of German-Jewish immigrants and lived in her early years in New York's Greenwich Village. She spent a few years in a girls' boarding school in Montreal, where she learned and perfected her French, and moved on to the University of Michigan for a bachelor's and master's degrees in art history. As the longtime chief restaurant critic of the New York Times, Ms. Reichel was known for her ability to make or break a restaurant, with her fierce attention to detail and her adventurous spirit. I don't know if any of you remember her reviews, but they were amazing. Tender at the Bone, this is one of her memoirs, was published in 1998, and it was a bestseller at the time. I'm going to read her little introduction at the very beginning, in which she talks about why she writes these essays. And then read the very first one, which has a wonderful title, The Queen of Mold. I'll leave you to think about that one till we get to it. Author's note. Storytelling in my family was highly praised. While my father walked home from work, he rearranged the events of his day to make them more entertaining, and my mother could make a trip to the supermarket sound like an adventure. If this required minor adjustments of fact, nobody much minded. It was certainly preferable to boring your audience. The good stories, of course, were repeated endlessly until they took on a life of their own. One of the stories I grew up on was a family legend about myself. Its point was to demonstrate my extraordinary maturity, even at the age of 2. This is how my father told it. One Sunday in early fall, we were sitting in our house in the country, admiring the leaves outside the picture window. Suddenly, the telephone rang. It was Miriam's mother in Cleveland, saying that her father was gravely ill. She had to go immediately, leaving me alone with Ruthie, who was to start nursery school that day. I, of course, had to be in the office Monday morning. Worse, I had an appointment I could not cancel. I simply had to catch the 707 to New York. But the school didn't open until 8, and although I phoned and phoned, I was unable to reach any of the teachers. I just didn't know what to do. In the end, I did the only thing I could think of. At 7, I took Ruthie to the school, sat her on a swing outside, and told her to tell the teachers when they came that she was Ruthie Reichel, and she had come to go to school. She sat there, waving bravely as I drove off. I knew she'd be fine. Even then, she was very responsible. He always ended by smiling proudly in my direction. Nobody ever challenged this story. I certainly didn't. It was not until I had a child of my own that I realized that nobody, not even my father, would leave a 2-year-old alone on a swing in a strange place for an hour. Did he exaggerate my age? The length of time? Both? By then, my father was no longer available for questions, but I am sure that if he had been, he would have insisted that the story was true. For him, it was. This book is absolutely in the family tradition. Everything here is true, but it may not be entirely factual. In some cases, I have compressed events. In others, I have made two people into one. I've occasionally embroidered. I learned early that the most important thing in life is a good story. The Queen of Mold. This is a true story. Imagine a New York City apartment at 6 in the morning. It's a modest apartment in Greenwich Village. Coffee is bubbling in an electric percolator. On the table is a basket of rye bread, an entire coffee cake, a few cheeses, a platter of cold cuts. My mother has been making breakfast, a major meal in our house, one where we sit down to fresh orange juice every morning, clink our glasses as if they held wine, and toast each other with, "Cheerio, have a nice day." Right now, she's the only one awake, but she's getting impatient for the day to begin, and she cranks WQXR up a little louder on the radio, hoping that the noise will rouse everyone else. But Dad and I are good sleepers, and when the sounds of martial music have no effect, she barges into the bedroom and shakes my father awake. "Darling," she says, "I need you. Get up and come into the kitchen." My father, a sweet and accommodating person, shuffles sleepily down the hall. He's wearing loose pajamas, and the strand of hair he combs over his bald spots strands straight up. He leans against the sink, holding onto it a little, and obediently opens his mouth when my mother says, "Try this." Later, when he told the story, he attempted to convey the awfulness of what she had given him. The first time he said that it tasted like cat toes and rotted barley. But over the years, the description got better. 2 years later, it had turned into pig snouts and mud. And 5 years later, he had refined the flavor into a mixture of antique anchovies and moldy chocolate. Whatever it tasted like, he said it was the worst thing he'd ever had in his mouth. So terrible that it was impossible to swallow. So terrible that he leaned over and spat it into the sink, and then grabbed the coffee pot, put the snout into his mouth, and tried to eradicate the flavor. My mother stood there watching all this. When my father finally put the coffee pot down, she smiled and said, "Just as I thought, spoiled." And then she threw the mess into the garbage can and sat down to drink her orange juice. For the longest time, I thought I had made this story up. But my brother insists that my father told it often, and with a certain amount of pride. As far as I know, my mother was never embarrassed by the telling, never even knew that she should have been. It's just the way she was, which was taste blind and unafraid of rot. "Well, it's just a little mold," I can remember her saying on the many occasions she scraped the fuzzy blue stuff off some concoction before serving what was left for dinner. She had an iron stomach and was incapable of understanding that other people did not. This taught me many things. The first was that food could be dangerous, especially to those who loved it. I took this very seriously. My parents entertained a great deal, and before I was 10, I had appointed myself guardian of the guests. My mission was to keep Mom from killing anybody who came to dinner. Her friends seemed surprisingly unaware that they took their lives in their hands each time they ate with us. They chalked their ailments up to the weather, the flu, or one of my mother's more unusual dishes. "No more sea urchins for me," I imagined Bert Langner saying to his wife Ruth after a dinner at our house. "They just don't agree with me." Little did he know that it was not the sea urchins that had made him ill, but that bargain beef my mother had found so irresistible. "I can make a meal out of anything," Mom told her friends proudly. She liked to brag about everything stew, a dish invented while she was concocting a casserole out of a 2-week-old turkey carcass. The very fact that my mother confessed to cooking with 2-week-old turkeys says a lot about her. She put the turkey and a half can of mushroom soup into the pot. Then she began rummaging around in the refrigerator. She found some leftover broccoli and added that. A few carrots went in, and then a half carton of sour cream. In a hurry, as usual, she added green beans and cranberry sauce. And then, somehow, half an apple pie slipped into the dish. Mom looked momentarily horrified. Then she shrugged and said, "Who knows? Maybe it will be good." And she began throwing everything in the refrigerator in along with it. Leftover pâté, some cheese ends, a few squishy tomatoes. That night, I set up camp in the dining room. I was particularly worried about the big eaters, and I stared at my favorite people as they approached the buffet, willing them away from the casserole. I actually stood directly in front of Bert Langner so he couldn't reach the turkey disaster. I loved him, and I knew that he loved food. Unknowingly, I had started sorting people by their tastes. Like a hearing child born to deaf parents, I was shaped by my mother's handicap, discovering that food could be a way of making sense of the world. At first, I paid attention only to taste, storing away the knowledge that my father preferred salt to sugar and my mother had a sweet tooth. Later, I also began to note how people ate and where. My brother liked fancy food in fine surroundings. My father only cared about the company, and Mom would eat anything, so long as the location was exotic. I was slowly discovering that if you watched people as they ate, you could find out who they were. Then I began listening to the way people talked about food, looking for clues to their personalities. What is she really saying, I asked myself, when Mom bragged about the invention of her famous corned beef ham. I was giving a party she'd begin, and as usual, I left everything for the last minute. Here she'd look at her audience, laughing softly at herself. I asked Ernst to do the shopping, but you know how absent-minded he is. Instead of picking up a ham, he brought me corned beef. She looked pointedly at Dad, who would look properly sheepish. "What could I do?" Mom asked. "I had people coming in a couple of hours. I had no choice." I simply pretended it was a ham. With that, Dad would look merrily at my mother, pick up his carving knife, and start serving the masterpiece. Here's the recipe for corned beef ham. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there is a recipe. Most mornings I got out of bed and went to the refrigerator to see how my mother was feeling. You could tell instantly just by opening the door. One day in 1960, I found a whole suckling pig staring at me. I jumped back and slammed the door hard. Then I opened it again. I'd never seen a whole animal in our refrigerator before. Even the chickens came in parts. He was surrounded by tiny crab apples, lady apples, my mother corrected me later, and a whole wreath of weird vegetables. This was not a bad sign. The more odd and interesting things there were in the refrigerator, the happier my mother was likely to be. Still, I was puzzled. The refrigerator in our small kitchen had been almost empty when I went to bed. "Where did you get all this stuff?" I asked. "The stores aren't even open yet." "Oh," said Mom blithely, patting at her crisp gray hair. "I woke up early and decided to go for a walk. You'd be surprised at what goes on in Manhattan at 4 a.m. I've been down to the Fulton Fish Market, and I found the most interesting produce store on Bleecker Street." "It was open?" I asked. "Well," she admitted, "not really." She walked across the worn linoleum and set a basket of bread on the Formica table. but I saw someone moving around, so I knocked. I've been trying to get ideas for the party. Party? I asked warily. What party? Your brother has decided to get married, she said casually, as if I should have somehow intuited this in my sleep. And of course, we're going to have a party to celebrate the engagement and meet Shelley's family. My brother, I knew, would not welcome this news. He was 13 years older than I and considered it a minor miracle to have reached the age of 25. I don't know how I survived her cooking, he said, as he was telling me about the years when he and Mom were living alone after she had divorced his father and was waiting to meet mine. She's a menace to society. Bob went to live with his father in Pittsburgh right after I was born, but he always came home for holidays. When he was there, he always helped me protect the guests, using tact to keep them from eating the more dangerous items. I took a more direct approach. Don't eat that, I ordered my best friend Jeannie, as her spoon dipped into one of Mom's more creative lunch dishes. My mother believed in celebrating every holiday. In honor of St. Patrick, she was serving bananas with green sour cream. I don't mind the color, said Jeannie, a trusting soul, whose own mother wouldn't dream of offering you an all-orange Halloween extravaganza, complete with milk dyed the color of orange juice. Ida served the sort of perfect lunches that I longed for. Neat squares of cream cheese and jelly on white bread, bologna sandwiches, Chef Boyardee, straight from the can. It's not just food coloring, I said. The sour cream was green to begin with. The carton's been in the refrigerator for months. Jeannie quickly put her spoon down, and when Mom went into the other room to answer the phone, we ducked into the bathroom and flushed our lunches down the toilet. That was great, ma'am, said Jeannie when Mom returned. May we be excused is all I said. I wanted to get away from the table before anything else appeared. Don't you want dessert, Mom asked. Sure, said Jeannie. No, I said. But Mom had already gone to get the cookies. She returned with some strange black lumps on a plate. Jeannie looked at them dubiously, then politely picked one up. Oh, go ahead, eat it, I said, reaching for one myself. They're just Girl Scout mint cookies. She left them on the radiator so all the chocolate melted off, but they won't kill you. As we munched our cookies, Mom asked idly, what do you girls think I should serve for Bob's engagement party? You're not going to have the party here, are you? I asked, holding my breath as I looked around at our living room, trying to see it with a stranger's eye. Mom had moments of decorating inspiration that usually died before the project was finished. The last one, a romance with Danish modern, had brought a teak dining table, a wicker chair that looked like an egg and hung from a chain, and a raya rug into our lives. The huge turquoise abstract painting along one wall dated from that period too, but Mom had, as usual, gotten bored. So they were all mixed together with my grandmother's drum table, an ornate break front, and some Japanese prints from an earlier, more conservative period. Then there was the bathroom, my mother's greatest decorating feat. One day she had decided on the spur of the moment to install gold towels, a gold shower curtain, and a gold rug. They were no problem, but painting all the porcelain gold was a disaster. It almost immediately began peeling off the sink, and it was years before any of us could take a bath without emerging slightly gilded. My father found all of this slightly amusing. An intellectual who had escaped his wealthy German Jewish family by coming to America in the 1920s, he had absolutely no interest in things. He was a book designer who lived in a black and white world of paper and type. Books were his only passion. He was kindly and detached, and if he had known that people described him as elegant, he would have been shocked. Clothes bored him enormously when he noticed them at all. No, said Mom. I exhaled. in the country. We have more room in Wilton, and we need to welcome Shelley into the family properly. I pictured our small, shabby summer house in the woods. Wilton is only an hour from New York, but in 1960 it was still very rural. My parents had bought the land cheaply and designed the house themselves. Since they couldn't afford an architect, they had miscalculated a bit, and the downstairs bedrooms were very strangely shaped. Dad hardly knew how to hold a hammer, but to save money, he had built the house himself with the aid of a carpenter. He was very proud of his handiwork, despite the drooping roof and awkward layout. He was even prouder of our long, rutted, meandering driveway. I didn't want to cut down a single tree, he said proudly, when people asked why it was so crooked. I loved the house, but I was slightly embarrassed by its unpainted wooden walls and unconventional character. Why can't we have the party in a hotel, I asked. In my mind's eye, I saw Shelley's impeccable mother, who seemed to go to the beauty parlor every day and wore nothing but custom-made clothes. Next to her, Mom, a handsome woman who refused to dye her hair, rarely wore makeup and had very colorful taste in clothes, looked almost bohemian. Shelley's mother wore an enormous diamond ring on her beautifully manicured finger. My mother didn't even wear a wedding band, and her fingernails were short and haphazardly polished. Nonsense, said Mom. It will be much nicer to have it at home. So much more intimate. I'd like them to see how we live, find out who we are. Great, I said under my breath to Jeannie. That'll be the end of Bob's engagement. And a couple of the relatives might die, but who worries about little things like that? Just make sure she doesn't serve steak tartare, said Jeannie, giggling. Steak tartare was the bane of my existence. Dad always made it for parties. It was a performance. First, he'd break an egg yolk into the mound of raw chopped steak, and then he'd begin folding minced onions and capers and Worcestershire sauce into the meat. He looked tall and suave as he mixed thoughtfully and then asked, his German accent very pronounced, for an assistant taster. Together, they added a little more of this or that, and then Dad carefully mounted the meat into a round, draped some anchovies across the top, and asked me to serve it. My job was to spread the stuff onto slices of party pumpernickel and pass the tray. Unless I had bought the meat myself, I tried not to let the people I liked best taste Dad's chef d'oeuvre. I knew that my mother bought prepackaged hamburger meat at the supermarket, and that if there happened to be some half-price, day-old stuff, she simply couldn't resist it. With our well-trained stomachs, my father and I could take whatever Mom was dishing out, but for most people, it was pure poison. Just thinking about it made me nervous. I've got to stop this party, I said. How? Asked Jeannie. I didn't know, but I had 4 months to figure it out. My best hope was that my mother's mood would change before the party took place. That was not unrealistic. My mother's moods were erratic. But March turned into April, and April into May, and Mom was still buzzing around. The phone rang constantly, and she was feeling great. She cut her gray hair very short and actually started wearing nail polish. She lost weight and bought a whole new wardrobe. Then she and Dad took a quick cruise to the Caribbean. We booked passage on a United Fruit Freighter, she said to her friends, so much more interesting than a conventional cruise. When asked about the revolutions that were then rocking the islands, she had a standard response. The bomb in the hotel lobby in Haiti made the trip much more interesting. When they returned, she threw herself into planning the party. I got up every morning and looked hopefully into the refrigerator. Things kept getting worse. Half a baby goat appeared. Next, there was cactus fruit. But the morning I found the box of chocolate-covered grasshoppers, I decided it was time to talk to Dad. The plans are getting more elaborate, I said ominously. Yes, said Dad politely. Parties didn't much interest him. It's going to be a disaster, I announced. Your mother gives wonderful parties, my father said loyally. He was remarkably blind to my mother's failings, regularly announcing to the world that she was a great cook. I think he actually believed it. He beamed when someone mentioned my mother's interesting dishes and considered it a compliment when they said, I've never tasted anything quite like that before. And of course, he never got sick. Did you know that she's planning it as a benefit for UNICEF, I asked. Really, he asked. Isn't that nice? He had turned back to the editorials. Dad, I said, trying to get him to see how embarrassing this could be. She's sending notices to the newspapers. She's inviting an awful lot of people. This thing is getting out of control. It's only a month away and she's nothing planned. It'll all work out, Dad said vaguely, folding the newspaper into his briefcase. Your mother is a very smart woman. She has a PhD. And then, as if there was no more to be said, he added, I'm sure you'll be a big help. It was hard to get mad at my father, who was as baffled by my mother's moods as I was, and just as helpless before them. They were like the weather, unpredictable, unavoidable, and often unpleasant. Dad, I think, enjoyed her energy, but then he could always go to the office when he needed to escape, which is what he did now. Disgusted, I called my brother. Bob lived uptown in a fancy apartment and had as little to do with my parents as he could decently get away with. She's planning to make my engagement party a benefit, he asked. You mean she expects Shelley's family to pay to attend? I hadn't quite considered that aspect, but I could see his point. I guess so, I said, but that's not the part that worries me. Can you imagine Mom cooking for over 100 people in the middle of summer? What if it's a really hot day? Bob groaned. Can't you get called away on business, I asked. What if you had a conference you had to go to? Wouldn't she have to call the whole thing off? Unfortunately, my mother was not the least bit fazed when informed that my brother might not be in town. The party's not for you, she said to Bob. It's for Shelley's family. They'll come even if you're too rude not to make an appearance. But Mom, said Bob, you can't ask them to buy tickets to the party. Why not, asked Mom. I think it's just disgusting the way people who have so much forget about those who are less fortunate. How could you possibly object to raising money for underprivileged children in honor of your marriage? I can't believe I have such a selfish, thoughtless son. And Mom slammed down the phone. She always managed to do that, always turned your arguments against you. And so there we were, 150 people invited to lunch on the lawn, a representative from UNICEF and photographers promised from all the newspapers. In one of her more grandiose moments, Mom wrote her old friend Bertrand Russell in Wales and asked him to come speak. Fortunately, he was nearing his 90th birthday and declined. But he did send 100 copies of his most recent anti-war booklet, a sort of fairy tale printed on gold paper. It was called History of the World in Epitome, for use in Martian infant schools, and it was very short. The last page was a picture of a mushroom cloud. These will make wonderful favors, Mom said smugly, pointing out that they were autographed. She was so pleased she sent out a few more invitations. What are you going to serve, I asked. Do you have any idea, she replied. Yes, I said, hire a caterer. Mom laughed as if I had made a joke. But she was moved to call and rent some tables and folding chairs, so at least the guests wouldn't be sitting on the ground. I suggested that she hire someone to help cook and serve, but she didn't seem to think that this was necessary. We can do that ourselves, she said blithely. Can't you get your friends to help? No, I said, I can't. But I did call Jeannie in the city and ask her to ask her parents if she could come out for the week. She thought my mother was exciting, and I needed moral support. As the party approached, things got worse and worse. Mom went on cleaning binges that left the house messier when she was done than when she started. And Jeannie and I went around behind her, desperately stuffing things back into closets to create some semblance of order. Mom mowed half the lawn. We mowed the other half. Meanwhile, my father, looking apologetic and unhappy, conveniently came up with a big project that kept him in the city. One morning, Mom went to a wholesale food company and came back honking her horn loudly, her car filled to the brim. Jeannie and I rushed out to unload 50 pounds of frozen chicken legs, 10 pounds of frozen lump crab meat, industrial-sized cans of tomato and split pea soup, 25-pound sacks of rice, and 2 cases of canned spiced peaches. "This must be the menu," I said to Jeannie. "What?" she asked. "I bet she's going to make that awful quick soup she thinks is so great. You know, it's all in all the magazines. You mix a can of tomato soup with a can of split pea soup, add a little sherry, and top it with crab meat." "Yuck," said Jeannie. "Then I guess she's going to cook these millions of chicken legs on top of rice. Although how she thinks she's going to cook them all in our little oven, I don't know. And the canned spiced peaches can be the vegetable. They're easy, because all you have to do is open the can and put them on the plates." I was surprised and relieved when she ordered a giant cake from the local bakery. That left only the hors d'oeuvres. I wondered what she had up her sleeve. The next day I found out. Jeannie and I were playing croquet, but we put down our mallets when Mom's horn started and watched the car speed through the trees, leaving billows of dust in its wake. We ran out to see what she had dragged home. "Horn and Hardart was having a sale," Mom announced triumphantly, pointing to the boxes around her. They were filled with hundreds of small cartons. It looked promising. "It's almost like getting it catered," I said happily to Jeannie as we toted the boxes inside. My happiness was short-lived. When I began opening the cartons, I found that each contained something different. "The automat sells leftovers for almost nothing at the end of the day," said Mom. "So I just took everything they had." She was very pleased with herself. "What are you going to do with it?" I asked. "Why, serve it," she said. "In what?" I asked. "Big bowls," she said. "But you don't have anything to put in big bowls," I pointed out. "All you have is hundreds of things to put in little bowls. Look," I began ripping the tops off the cartons. "This one is potato salad. This one is coleslaw. This one is cold macaroni and cheese. Here's a beet salad. Here's some sliced ham. Nothing matches." "Don't worry," said Mom. "I'm sure we can make something out of all of this. After all, everything in it is good." "Yes," I muttered to Jeannie, "and by the time it gets served, everything in it will be 4 days old. It will be a miracle if it's not moldy." "I think it would be better if it was," said practical Jeannie. "If people see mold, at least they won't eat it." "Pray for rain," I said. Unfortunately, when I woke up on the day of the party, there was not a cloud in the sky. I pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep, but not for long. "Nobody sleeps today," Mom announced, inexorably pulling back the covers. "It's party day." Some of the food had acquired a thin veneer of mold, but Mom blithely scraped it off and began mixing her terrible Horn and Hardart mush. "It's delicious," she cried, holding out a spoonful. It wasn't. Fortunately, it looked even worse than it tasted. I thought the chicken legs were a little dubious, too. In order to get them all cooked, we had started 2 days earlier, and the refrigerator couldn't hold them all. But they glistened invitingly, and the oven-baked rice looked fine. We spooned the peaches into Mom's big glass bowls, and they looked beautiful. I wasn't very happy about the soup. Mom had left the crab meat out of the freezer to defrost for 2 days, and even she didn't like the way it was smelling. I think I'll just add a little more sherry, she kept saying as she poured in bottles of the stuff. People will get drunk on the soup, I said. Fine, she said gaily. Then maybe they'll donate more to UNICEF. My brother arrived, took one look at the rickety chairs on our uneven lawn, and headed straight for the bar. Mom had hired some local high school boys to be bartenders, and they were pouring whiskey as if it were Coke. You've got to stay sober, I said to him. You've got to make sure that nobody in Shelley's family eats the soup, and they should probably watch out for the chicken, too. Bob had another drink. My memories of the party are mercifully blurred, but a yellowed clipping from the Norwalk Hour tells part of the story. My mother looks radiantly into the camera beneath a headline reading, Wilton Family Hosts Benefit for UNICEF. A family photograph of me handing a check to a grinning official in front of a sign that says Security Council in both French and English tells another part of the tale. But my brother owns the end of the story. 35 years later, his children can still make him turn green by asking, remember the time Nana Mimi poisoned everyone? Oh, he moans, don't remind me. It was awful. First, she extorted money from them. Then she gave out those anti-bomb favors. It was the early 60s, for Christ's sake, and these were conservative businessmen and housewives. But the worst thing was the phone calls. They kept coming all night long. Nobody felt good. 26 of them actually ended up in the hospital having their stomachs pumped. What a way to meet the family. I missed all that, but I do remember the phone ringing while we were still cleaning up. Mom was still exulting in the photographer's flashbulbs and saying for what seemed like the 47th time, look how much money we raised. She picked up the receiver. Yes, said Mom brightly. I think she expected it to be another reporter. Then her voice drooped with disappointment. Who doesn't feel well? There was a long silence. Mom ran her hand through her chic, short coiffure. Really, she said, sounding shocked. All of them? She slumped a little as her bright red fingernails went from her hair to her mouth. Then her back straightened and her head shot up. Nonsense, I heard her say into the phone. We all feel fine. And we ate everything. The Queen of Mold. I think she writes, charmingly. The rest of the book is a lot like this, but I think this one is the winner.